Cops drag a black woman outside court, then realize she's the judge presiding that day. The courtroom doors slam open with a force that rattles the windows. The crowd inside gasps, eyes widening as two uniformed officers drag a woman down the steps, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The tension in the air is thick enough to cut with a knife. Her face is pale, her body trembling, but she refuses to speak. As the officers yank her forward, a murmur rises from the onlookers. "What the hell is going on?" Someone whispers. "Who is she?" But then, something shocking happens. Something that makes the entire room fall dead silent. The woman's heels click sharply on the marble floor as she's pulled out. Her once strong stride now reduced to nothing more than a powerless shuffle. The officers don't even notice it at first, until they reach the door and she stops, her eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," she says, her voice steady, her eyes sharp. The officer in front of her turns around, his brows furrowed. "What mistake?" he sneers. "You're under arrest for disrupting the peace. You're not going anywhere." She tilts her head slightly as if the words he's saying don't even faze her. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Her voice is calm, but the confidence in it sends a ripple through the crowd. And then, with a chilling sense of realization, one of the officers stumbles back, his eyes going wide. He looks at her, then at the judge's bench behind him. A flicker of panic crosses his face. The woman stands taller now, her voice cutting through the air. "I'm the judge presiding over this court today. You've just arrested me, officer." The courtroom falls into stunned silence. No one moves, no one breathes. The officers stare at her like they've seen a ghost. The crowd is in shock, struggling to comprehend what's just happened. And as the truth begins to sink in, so does the harsh reality of what just unfolded. How did this happen? How did the system get this wrong? What led to this moment where an officer, sworn to serve and protect, could drag a judge out of the courtroom in handcuffs? Stay tuned. This is just the beginning of a story that'll leave you questioning everything. Meet Tiffany Johnson, a name most folks in the courthouse would probably never forget. But before today, her name was just another one in a sea of faces, at least to the average person. A woman of dignity, intellect, and quiet strength. Tiffany wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She didn't have the kind of advantages some people take for granted. Raised in a neighborhood where opportunities were few and far between, she had to fight every day to prove her worth, especially as a black woman in the legal system. She'd grown up in South Philly, yeah, the kind of block where you'd hear "yo" every other sentence, and the tension between what was right and what was easy seemed to hang heavy in the air. But Tiffany? She didn't take the easy route. She made sure to walk the straight and narrow, despite the temptations around her. Raised by her grandmother, who worked 2 jobs just to keep the roof over their heads, Tiffany always had one thing drilled into her: make it count. It wasn't just a motto, it was a survival strategy. She put herself through law school, studying late into the night with textbooks scattered across the tiny kitchen table in their cramped apartment. No one gave her anything for free. She had to grind, prove she belonged, and deal with the fact that people like her often had to work 10 times harder than everyone else. Even when she earned her degree and started as a public defender, it wasn't easy. There were whispers behind her back, subtle slights she had to endure, snide remarks like, "She's just here to tick a box," or "Who gave her the chance?" But Tiffany didn't let it faze her. She rose through the ranks, pushed her way to the bench, and today, she was about to preside over the court for the first time as the judge. She was nervous, sure, but it wasn't the kind of fear that comes from uncertainty. It was the fear of letting down everyone who had ever doubted her. The weight of representing her community, the people who had supported her, the people who were still stuck on the same streets she had left behind. It wasn't just about her, but about them. And today she was going to prove that someone who looked like her, who came from where she came from, could sit in that chair. She belonged. But the courtroom that morning didn't make it easy for her. It was a gray, overcast day outside, the kind of day where everything felt just a little off, like the world was on edge. The building's old stone walls seemed to echo with a history of injustice, and the atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. Tiffany could feel the eyes on her as she walked into the room, all of them, every single person in the courtroom, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. Her black dress and crisp white blouse, neatly pressed, felt like a uniform, a shield against the doubt she knew would be thrown her way. Her assistant, a young woman named Alicia, handed her the docket for the day, but Tiffany barely noticed. Her eyes were focused on the back of the room, where the usual suspects were filing in, lawyers who had heard of her but never worked with her, a jury full of people whose opinions were already made up. There was Officer Smith, a tall, beefy guy with a serious attitude. Tiffany had known him since he was just a rookie, all cocky swagger and ready to take on the world. But now there was something about him that rubbed her the wrong way. He never seemed to look her in the eye. He didn't even nod at her as he walked into the courtroom. It was like he was pretending she wasn't there. Then there was Danny Fields, a public defender who was good at his job but known for playing the system, bending the rules just enough to get his clients off. He and Tiffany had gone head-to-head a few times already, each argument more heated than the last. Danny was a big deal in Philly's legal scene, but Tiffany wasn't intimidated. She'd seen people like him before, always looking for an angle, always thinking they could outsmart someone. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. And then, just before the session started, the door opened. In walked a young black man, looking nervous but determined. His name was Marcus, a kid who had been caught up in a bad situation. He was barely 19, but the world had already stacked up against him. Tiffany had seen his case come across her desk the night before, and it didn't sit well with her. Marcus was accused of stealing a car, an offense that, in many ways, felt too trivial for someone like him to be facing serious charges for. But she couldn't just let him go without taking a look at everything. She needed to hear both sides, and that's when it all started to feel like a trap. The tension in the room was rising. Tiffany was about to preside over her first case as a judge, but as the gavel came down, something in the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a side-eye here, a whispered word there, but it was real. Tiffany felt it deep in her bones. The system wasn't built for her. And worse, it was made to push her down. She could already tell that some folks were waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to mess up. The fact that she had made it this far wasn't going to change their opinions of her. They'd always see her as the other. She would always be just another black woman in a position they didn't think she earned. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that Tiffany wasn't just there to preside over cases. She was there to challenge the system itself. The stage was set. The cracks in the foundation had already begun to form. But no one could have predicted how it would all go down. The gavel came down, but the unease in the courtroom didn't subside. Tiffany Johnson had just started her first day as a judge, but the walls of the courtroom felt more like a cage, thick with suspicion and silent judgment. The weight of centuries of systemic racism seemed to press down on her shoulders. It wasn't a tangible thing, but it was there, lurking behind every glance, every whispered word, every subtle gesture, and she could feel it, every damn second. Tiffany cleared her throat, her voice strong but steady. We're here today to hear the case of Marcus Fields. This court will proceed with fairness, and I expect respect for the legal process. The room fell quiet, but the looks she got were anything but respectful. It wasn't even the defendants or their lawyers that bothered her. It was the faces of the officers, the jury, the witnesses, people who thought they knew what was best for Marcus just because of the color of his skin. People who didn't know what it was like to walk into a room and feel the tension rise when you weren't the one everyone expected to be in charge. People who wouldn't get the chance to prove themselves before their every move was under a microscope. Marcus's case wasn't a slam dunk for her. It wasn't as clear-cut as people would have liked. Yes, he was caught in a stolen car, no denying that. But what didn't sit right with Tiffany was the way the system was set up to crush people like him, with zero room for redemption, zero grace for mistakes. She saw a scared kid who was being railroaded, a kid who didn't deserve to be labeled a criminal before he'd even been given a chance to speak. But it didn't help that everyone else in the room was already making assumptions. Danny Fields, the public defender, shuffled papers nervously at his table. He had a reputation for cutting corners, but Tiffany knew he wasn't a bad guy. He was a product of the system just like everyone else. But even he couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders as he looked at her. Your Honor, the evidence is clear, Danny said, leaning forward. My client is guilty of theft, and we'd like to proceed to sentencing. Tiffany raised an eyebrow, keeping her voice calm. We are not proceeding to sentencing just yet, Mr. Fields. We are in a court of law, not a factory line. The words came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't help it. The anger she was holding back was starting to burn at the edges of her composure. She turned her gaze to Officer Smith, whose arms were crossed tightly across his chest. He was standing in the back of the room, watching her every move. His eyes were cold, like he didn't want her there, like he was just waiting for her to make the wrong move. Tiffany could feel the weight of his judgment, just like she could feel the heat of everyone else's. But what made it worse was that he knew, he could probably get away with it. A young black woman who worked hard, got her degree, fought for her place, only to be doubted at every turn. But she wasn't going to let them see her sweat. "Officer Smith," Tiffany said, her voice cool, "can you tell the court about the circumstances under which the vehicle was recovered?" The officer's gaze shifted just a little, like he didn't expect her to ask him anything. Yeah, Your Honor. We found the car abandoned, and the suspect, Mr. Fields, was nearby. We had a description from a witness." Tiffany nodded, not buying a word of it. "And how reliable is that witness? What's their background?" Smith hesitated. "They were, a concerned citizen, Your Honor." Tiffany felt her teeth clench. This wasn't about Marcus. This wasn't even about the case. This was about how they viewed him. A concerned citizen could mean anything. A biased neighbor, a white woman clutching her purse as Marcus walked by. But she couldn't say it, not yet. Not in front of everyone. Tiffany paused, letting the silence stretch. The eyes of everyone in the room were on her, waiting for her to mess up, waiting for her to say something, anything that they could twist. But she wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. She motioned to Alicia, who stood behind her at the desk. "Get me the case files for Marcus Fields' prior offenses. I need to know exactly what we're working with here." But as Alicia left to gather the documents, Tiffany's mind wandered. She thought back to her own childhood in South Philly, how every day her grandmother had warned her about the world outside. "Don't trust them, Tiffany," she would say. "They'll smile in your face and stab you in the back the first chance they get." She had grown up hearing that, knowing it, but still she had to walk out into the world with her head held high, even when the world didn't want to let her rise. "You'll never be as good as them, you know." The words echoed in her mind like a taunt, but they weren't new. She'd heard them from teachers, classmates, even people in her own community who didn't believe she could do it. But she did, and she would keep doing it, no matter what they said. As Alicia returned with the files, Tiffany felt a chill run down her spine. There it was, the truth. Marcus had a record, but it wasn't a record of violent crime, wasn't a record that warranted the punishment they were ready to hand down. But the system? The system didn't care about the details. It cared about labels. It cared about who deserved to be locked away and who deserved a second chance. As the court moved on, Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. And when Marcus's mother showed up late, her face twisted with concern, Tiffany knew. She knew there was something bigger happening here, something that no one had accounted for. The rising tension was palpable, but Tiffany wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. The weight of the courtroom's silence pressed down on Tiffany as she sat back in her chair. The gavel had fallen, but it wasn't just the end of a trial. No, this was the beginning of something much bigger. The truth had cracked open, and now the pieces of the system were starting to fall apart, revealing things that no one wanted to face. As the courtroom emptied, the mood was no longer tense, it was frozen. Tiffany's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the final judgment, her eyes scanning the text, but her mind was miles away. She had done the right thing, or at least that's what she told herself. But the backlash was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy. Her heart sank as she watched Marcus, the young man who had fought to survive in a broken system, step out of the courtroom with his mother. There was no celebrating, no cheers, just silence. His eyes were hollow, his face an exhausted mask of uncertainty. Marcus had gotten a second chance, but it felt like a hollow victory. The relief was fleeting. Outside, the weight of the world was waiting for them. They weren't safe, not yet. Tiffany tried to focus on the next case, but her mind kept replaying the conversation she'd had with Officer Smith just hours before the verdict was announced. She could still feel the icy tension between them, the disbelief in his eyes when she had challenged the system. He hadn't been ready for that. He wasn't ready for her. Officer Smith had let something slip during the trial. Tiffany couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just about Marcus or the stolen car. There were bigger things at play, things that stretched far beyond what she could see from her bench. Tiffany had caught a glimpse of the corruption, but she knew she was just scratching the surface. She couldn't let it go. Tiffany's phone buzzed on the desk in front of her. A message from Alicia. You need to see this. The text attached to the message was a headline that made Tiffany's stomach drop. Officer Smith linked to corruption in evidence tampering scandal. The article detailed a series of missteps, suspicious arrests, missing evidence, and improper handling of cases, all leading back to Smith. It was like a punch to the gut, but it also wasn't surprising. Tiffany had suspected something for a while, but this was the smoking gun. Smith wasn't just guilty of trying to intimidate her, he was part of a much bigger web of deceit. Tiffany leaned back in her chair, her fingers trembling as she read through the article. This wasn't just about racial bias anymore. It was about abuse of power, and she was caught right in the middle of it. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let it slide. Minutes later, Tiffany found herself standing outside the courthouse, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. She needed a moment to breathe, to process everything that had just happened. She could hear the distant sound of sirens, the hum of the city, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Danny Fields. Judge, Danny's voice crackled on the other end. I just wanted to check on you. I know things got pretty heated today, but you did the right thing. You really did. Tiffany didn't respond immediately. She didn't feel like she had done the right thing. She felt like she was caught in a storm she couldn't control. You don't understand, she finally said, her voice quieter than she meant. It's bigger than just this case. This whole system, it's broken, Danny. I can't be the only one who sees it. Danny paused. I know, Tiffany. But sometimes speaking out can cost you. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's about surviving this mess we're stuck in. The words hit hard. Tiffany had always known the truth about the system, but now, hearing it from someone else, it made the weight of it all feel even heavier. It was true. Standing up for what's right in this world. It wasn't just hard. It could destroy you. The day wore on, and Tiffany's thoughts continued to swirl. The consequences of her decisions were becoming clearer. Word was spreading about her ruling, and she could already feel the stares, the whispers behind her back, the murmurs about her being too lenient. She knew that her decisions would be scrutinized, torn apart. People were going to challenge her every move. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her grandmother, who had always been her rock. It simply read, I'm proud of you, baby. But be careful. Don't let them break you down. Tiffany's heart tightened. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now it felt like the fight was just beginning. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready. She didn't know if she could handle what was coming. As Tiffany stared out the courthouse window, her thoughts drifted back to her community, the people she was trying to protect, the people who had supported her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the system wasn't built for them. And the more she fought, the more she was going to expose how deep the corruption ran, but she wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. Tiffany had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to be the only one who paid for it. The air was thick with tension. The weight of what Tiffany was about to face pressed down on her chest, a suffocating reminder that every choice she had made so far had led to this moment. The courthouse had emptied hours ago, but the lingering feeling in the air still made her skin crawl. It wasn't the feeling of accomplishment. It wasn't the satisfaction of justice. No, this was something darker. The moment she'd walked into her office, she felt the storm waiting for her. It wasn't just the whispers. Those had been there from the beginning. No, this was something more. She knew the people she was up against, and she knew they would stop at nothing to tear her down. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Alicia. Get out of there now. Tiffany frowned, her stomach sinking. It was too late for that now. Alicia's warning was nothing compared to the battle that was already underway, a battle that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with survival. Before Tiffany could process the message, the door to her office slammed open. It was Officer Smith, the same man who had eyed her every moment in the courtroom, who had let slip about the corruption he was tied to, who had made every effort to undermine her from the inside. He didn't even knock, just barged in with his broad shoulders and a cocky smirk. "Judge Johnson," he said, his voice low but dangerously calm. "We need to talk." "I don't think you realize what kind of mess you're in." Tiffany stood from her chair, taking a step back. "What's this about, officer?" He glanced over his shoulder, ensuring no one was in the hall, then locked the door behind him. "It's about you," he sneered, stepping forward into the room, his eyes cold, calculating. "About your little ruling today. You think you're going to change the system? You think you're going to get away with all this? Think again." Her heart pounded in her chest, but Tiffany refused to back down. She held her ground, meeting his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm not going to let you intimidate me, Smith." He laughed, a sound that made Tiffany's skin crawl. "Intimidate you? Nah, I don't need to intimidate you. You've already sealed your fate, Judge. You just don't know it yet." He took another step closer. "You're not a part of their world, and they'll make sure you remember that." The hairs on Tiffany's neck stood on end. She had heard rumors, but this was real. "What are you talking about?" Smith's smile faltered, his eyes flashing with something darker. "You think you're safe just because you sit behind that bench? Nah, you're not even a real judge in their eyes. You're just a puppet. You always have been, and now you've gone too far. The system doesn't like people like you, people who make waves, and I'm here to make sure you get the message." Tiffany felt the room closing in on her. The walls seemed to press in, the air getting thicker. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This wasn't just about a stolen car or a corrupt officer. It was about her life, her entire career being in jeopardy. She took a deep breath. "You can't scare me, Smith. You don't control me." "I'm not backing down." His lips twisted into a grin, but it wasn't one of humor. It was a warning. "You're already in too deep, Judge. They don't like you challenging the status quo. And let me tell you, this is just the beginning." Before Tiffany could react, the door behind Smith flew open, and two more officers stormed in, blocking her exit. They were not friendly faces, the same officers who had been in the courtroom earlier, the ones who had glared at her from the back of the room. They were here to make sure she understood the weight of what she had done. They weren't here for a conversation. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to silence her. Smith stepped back, his grin widening as the two officers grabbed Tiffany's arms, dragging her toward the door. "I warned you," he hissed. Tiffany's heart raced. She fought against the officers, her fists clenched, but they were too strong, too prepared. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence that filled the hallway. The officers shoved her into a nearby interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The door slammed shut behind her, and Tiffany's pulse was deafening in her ears. Her mind raced. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. Her thoughts flashed back to her grandmother's warning. "Don't let them break you, baby." But the fight had already begun. Tiffany had crossed a line, and now she was going to feel the consequences of it. The room was stark, cold, no windows, no way out. Tiffany tried to push her panic down, focusing on the way her hands trembled as she clasped them together. Her breath was shallow and her thoughts were scattered, and then the door opened again. A tall figure stepped into the room, Danny Fields. But he wasn't the Danny she knew. This wasn't the guy who had once shared a drink with her after a long day in court. This was someone else. Someone hardened, someone who knew exactly how much trouble they were in. "They're going to make you disappear," Danny said, his voice hoarse, his eyes dark. "I tried to warn you, Tiffany. The system doesn't play fair, and now they're going to crush you under their heel." Tiffany took a step forward. You knew? You let them do this?" Danny flinched, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I had no choice. None of us did." Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. This was worse than she imagined. Danny was in on it, part of the system that was designed to keep people like her down, to keep the corruption alive. She wasn't just fighting the officers. She was fighting the whole damn system, and this was their way of making sure she didn't get any further. Her chest tightened, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. The injustice was no longer just a theory, it was a brutal reality. Her heart sank as she realized just how much danger she was really in. The people she thought she could trust, they had already made their peace with the system. But Tiffany wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let them win. Tiffany sat on the cold bench in the holding cell, her head heavy, her body aching from the fight she'd just endured. The weight of everything, the injustice, the fight, the betrayal, sat on her shoulders like a mountain she wasn't sure how to climb. But as she stared at the bare white walls, her thoughts began to clear. She wasn't sure if the fight was over or if it had just begun, but one thing was for sure. She couldn't back down now. Not when so many people had been let down by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The world outside was still spinning, still moving forward without her. But for the first time, Tiffany felt like she had a chance to make something different happen. She had stepped into that courtroom as a judge and fought for what was right. She had made her stand. As the door to the holding cell creaked open, Tiffany didn't flinch. It was Alicia. She had come through, she always did. "We've got your back, Tiffany," Alicia said softly, her voice a comforting presence in the sterile silence of the room. "It's not over. This is just the beginning. People are waking up. You've got the community's support. Don't you forget that." Tiffany stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. She wiped a tear away from her cheek, one she hadn't even realized had fallen. "I don't know if I can keep fighting like this, Alicia. The system is built to crush people like me, like Marcus." Alicia smiled, the kind of smile that told Tiffany everything she needed to hear. "You already are. You've already made a difference. And you know what? You're not alone anymore. People are seeing it. They're seeing the truth." But Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling that the world she was fighting against was far bigger than what she could handle alone. The web of corruption and systemic racism stretched so deep, it seemed impossible to untangle. There were still so many people out there like Marcus, trapped by a system that didn't care about their lives, their futures. It was a brutal truth that kept her awake at night, and as she walked out of the holding cell, she realized something. This was bigger than her. The fight she was in was more than just a case or a courtroom. This was about a system built on injustice, one that didn't see people like her as equals, as worthy of respect. The story of Marcus wasn't just about a young man who had been caught up in a crime he didn't deserve to be charged for. It was about every single person who had been labeled a criminal because of their skin color, their name, their address, their circumstances. It was about the countless lives ruined by a system that profited off their downfall. And Tiffany, for all her pain and heartache, had just become a symbol that you didn't have to play by their rules, that no matter how loud the voices around you screamed that you didn't belong, you still had a right to be there. Her phone buzzed as she stepped outside the courthouse, blinking against the sunlight that felt like a new beginning. It was a message from Danny Fields, the public defender who had been with her since the beginning of this mess. "The community's behind you. Keep going. Don't stop." Tiffany took a deep breath, knowing the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but now at least she wasn't fighting alone. And in that moment, something inside her changed. This was a fight she was willing to continue. Her mind drifted back to her grandmother's words. "Don't let them break you down, baby." Tiffany smiled softly to herself. She wouldn't. No matter what came next, she wasn't backing down. Because this fight wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. About everyone who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or silenced. The impact was already rippling outward, and she could feel the change starting to happen. It wasn't just about this case or this one courtroom. It was about waking up a system that had stayed asleep for too long. As Tiffany walked away from the courthouse, her head held high, she knew one thing for sure. The struggle was far from over, but this was the moment when everything began to shift.